With class. DW, could I ask you to start us in a prayer, please?
Father, thank you for the reading this morning. It's a beautiful morning. Thank you for your creation and for all the good things that you've done for us in the past and continue to do for us. We thank you especially for your love and steadfast love for us, for Jesus, always taking care of us. Be with John and Dave's lesson this morning, and we'll study your word and the way of
Thank you. All right. Remember, those of you who were here last week, we spent some time covering the creation stories of other people groups that the Israelites would have known something about. Kind of through word of mouth coming down from Abraham. It's likely that they knew the Sumerian and Babylonian creation stories. And of course, they were probably just no more than 40 years after their exodus from Egypt. And it's even more likely that they knew the Egyptian creation stories. And so we went through those. Well, like Paul Harvey used to say, well, this isn't the rest of the story, this is the real story. And so, anyone remember what God created on day one? Well, light, somebody say? Okay. Now, when the story begins, I mean, verse 1 is actually, it's kind of an introduction, and when it says in the beginning, it's not talking about a particular point in time. It's talking about a period of time. This was the beginning of creation, and so when the creation story starts, the earth and some type of heaven already existed. And so Bob?
Studied with a Messianic Jew. That in Hebrew, some people can translate that as in beginning, God, instead of in the beginning. But in the beginning means the very start of everything. But in beginning, God's already in a process, and now in beginning, he starts this new process. So it's a little bit different thought process of
Right. Right. Yeah, in the beginning, we in English use the to describe a very specific something. And I think I had heard that before, but hearing you say it brought it back to mind that that does make a lot of sense. And somebody who speaks Hebrew, that would jump out at them. And so I think that's right, because it's it's just a period, and that's one of the things I think that's hard to get my mind around is, well, we'll talk about the age of the earth later on, but what did God do before Genesis 1-2? I've thought about that a lot, and I can't figure anything out. Now, I was in a class one time, and the preacher said that in the Hebrew, which I don't know, I'm just telling you what he said, is there are some people who believe that there was a creation there was one or more creations prior to this, and that the Hebrew words there created, it could be translated, according to this guy, recreated. Yeah, I guess he had to practice. And, the theory was, well, that's where all the, fossils and dinosaur bones came from, was from the creation before the one we're living in. I'd never found that particularly persuasive, but I'm just throwing it out there in case you might have might have heard that, or you might hear it at some point in the future. So God creates light, and he separates the light from the darkness, and he calls the light day and the darkness night. Then the next day, what does he do? Anybody remember? He what? Okay. He separated the water from the water, and I don't know that all translations say it, but he made a firmament. And we talked about the cosmology, or how the ancient peoples viewed the world that they could see, and the stars and whatnot. And so firmament was how they looked at it. They looked at it as a hard barrier in which the stars were and whatnot. And so apparently there existed water, because we know that verse 2, it says that the earth was covered with water. Well, there must have been waters up above somewhere that existed. And so God created a firmament. He separated the waters above and the waters below. That's something to remember when we get to the flood, because where did all the water come from? Well, it says I think it's Genesis 6, that the fountains of the deep broke open. And, in somewhat recent times, scientists have discovered that there is basically kind of a worldwide underground ocean that has more water in it than all of the oceans and lakes and whatnot on the surface. And so if the earth broke open so that those waters could come up, well, then the text says that God opened the windows of heaven so that the waters up above the firmament could fall. So the waters came up from the bottom and down from the top. So remember that for chapter 6. All right, day 3, what did he create? Dry land and oceans. Yes. All right. We're going to talk about the dry land and the seas here in just a little bit, in a little bit more detail. All right, day 4, what did he do? The sun, the moon, and the stars. Yes.
Let there be light, verse 3.
Mm-hmm.
What was that light? And the light and the darkness, and then the days and the day and the night. That's how we get our day and night, from the sun, right?
Well, it says that, the sun and the moon and the stars, basically, they help us measure time. And I think where, the light came from there, in Revelation, and I think I've got the verse written down later on in my notes, where John writes that they don't need any sun there because God and the Lamb are the light. And so I think the light here it came from God himself in some form or fashion. Yeah.
Well, my favorite passage in the Bible is John 1, 1 through 4 and 14.
Okay.
But you'll probably get to this eventually. But
go ahead.
It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. He was in the beginning with
right.
God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and darkness did not comprehend it. And if you skip down to 14, it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Well, that can only be one person.
Right.
So when it talks about divided the light from the darkness, I think it's kind of talking about Jesus. Not that he created Jesus, he was already there.
Right.
But it does say that in him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Well, what would that be? What would it be that the darkness did not comprehend it? I personally think Satan probably. Satan did
Right.
not, and still does not, understand Jesus. He still thinks he has a chance.
Right.
But he does not. He's already lost.
Right.
But I think that's what it's talking about when it talks about the light in Genesis, is Jesus was the light.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's, but, day and night, it's important because of, how we were made as creatures that, we can't go 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. We can't physically do it. And people have studied the lack of sleep on how it affects people. And the longer you go without sleep, your brain really starts doing funny things. And you're not able to think straight. And as a consequence, you're not able to do the things that you want to do. And so, being without sleep is not good. And it's hard, anybody ever worked a night shift? How's it like trying to sleep in the daytime? Right? Right. I mean, even if you have blackout, blinds or something. Right. Yeah. Scott?
I don't know the answer to all this. Here's an idea. Okay, so if you're going to paint painting, the very first thing you'd have to have is a canvas, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to make the canvas. So to me, the first day was him creating the whole universe. Light is a fundamental thing in the whole universe. It's like one of the constants of
Right.
And I wonder if he didn't just, when he's talking about this to these people that don't understand anything at all, he's basically saying, I made all the constants in the universe, the fundamental structure of the whole universe.
Mm-hmm.
Because God stood outside of all that.
Right.
And it wasn't here before Jesus and God and the Spirit created it.
Right. And that's, and we're going to look in just a minute about some of the parallels between the creation stories of other people groups and the real creation story as revealed by God through Moses. Yeah.
In the beginning, God created, the Hebrew root for created is bara,
Yes.
which means to create something out of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So, but this is, for most of my text in the NIV, most of the other things, when it's talking about creating people, it's worded as brought forth or made from.
Right.
So the actual creation was who. There was only one creation, and everything else in it comes from that creation.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point and important when we get to the comparison. Okay, day 5. What did God create? Yes.
I was going to say something before you.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Well, looking at it scientifically, said let there be light in the electrons. Which they think is that like the first particle.
Mm-hmm.
So, just throw that in.
Okay. Every little bit, I think, helps us picture what happened. And so, anything that you've read or studied or heard, be sure to bring that up because that'll help us all flesh it out in our minds. Okay.
You're not going to come to it.
Well, no,
We're
that's
not figuring it out in here.
no. I mean, our minds are.
We can throw out all our ideas. But in the beginning, this matters. God made everything.
Yes.
It's beyond us. How we do it.
Right. Our minds are not capable of understanding everything that God understands. All we have a hope of understanding is what He's chosen to reveal to us. And even with that, sometimes there's ambiguities in it, and I think purposely there's ambiguity in it. But God wants us, I think, to puzzle through these thoughts that we might have based on reading what he inspired his writers to pen for us. And the creation story is maybe one of the biggest things that we have to puzzle through. Okay, day 5. Yeah, Roy?
Well, I got an illustration about what happens when you lose a lot of sleep.
Okay.
I was doing a job in Frankfurt, Missouri. And I got done with it, so we want you to stay and do another one. Got some milk on food driving through it and put it on, something like stay in another. They said, it's only a week to do this job. All the overtime that you can handle.
Okay.
I said, nope, I'm not going to do it. My helper said, well, I need money. So I said, okay.
Yeah.
So we started this job on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And at 11 o'clock the next Saturday, I loaded my tool. Okay. Sunday morning, I got up to go to church. Now, I worked 60 hours double time, plus the regular time. Okay. I reached in my coat pocket, and I had a paper clip, and I told my wife, I said, I know what this is, but I can't remember the name of it. She said, you're not going to work tomorrow.
Yep. Yes.
Residents, doctors, doing these 36-hour shifts. My son is in the ER doc, and he sleeps an hour here, an hour there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm amazed that doctors make it through that.
I don't know why they do it. Maybe it's because they've always done it that way.
I've read stories about that. That seems to be the consensus is, well, we've always done it that way, and if your grandpa did it and your dad did it, well, you should be able to. It's a rite of passage.
Most of those doctors that are doing that are still fairly young. I don't think at my age, if I was a doctor, I couldn't handle those kind of hours.
No,
No way.
no, absolutely not.
My mother always told me, make sure you're the first one.
Yes.
She said, don't be one of the last
No,
ones of the day.
don't be going in at 4 o'clock. All right, so day 5, birds and sea creatures. Day 6, the last creation day. What did God create? Animals and us, okay? And that's in verse 24 through 31, also chapter 2, 4 through the end of the chapter. And we're going to come back and look at each day in detail. But that gives us, that's a comparison to the other creation stories we looked at. And so the original condition of the earth, well, the Sumerian Babylonian view, I wasn't able to find anything about what they thought about the condition of the world, at the start of their creation story. But there's parallels between the real story given to the Israelites and the Egyptians, because the Egyptians, if you remember, thought that everything was water and that there was some pre-existing being that rose up from the waters, and then that's the deity, and I'm using all these terms with quotes, that was responsible for starting the creation process. As far as the creator, in Sumer and Babylon, it was Apsu, who was not to be confused with the Cartwright's cook, Hopsing. Followed by Anu and Ki, who were parents of Enlil and Enki, also called Ea. And remember we talked about them, that Apsu was killed by, I think it was Enki, and they chopped his body up into little parts and mixed it in with the clay, and then they pick up little balls of clay, and that's what they used to create human beings and the animals. Egypt, Atum was their creator god, and he was born from an egg and, like I said, rose up out of the water to start the creation process. And of course, in the Bible, Jehovah created the physical universe, but he didn't create any lesser gods, unlike the other two creation stories. He did create angels, which are at a level between us and God. So they're stronger than we are. They're probably smarter than we are. But they're certainly not at God's level. They're not. They're never referred to as gods. They're referred to as always as angels. All right, yeah. Right. Right. Creation materials. Talked about clay being made from the body of poor Apsu. In Egypt, we don't really know what the creation materials were. As far as we know, Atum just spoke it maybe. So that may be a parallel to the true story. In the Bible, the spoken word kind of kicked it all off. As Bob mentioned, God then took the elements of his creation to make other things that came to exist. And in fact, it's interesting, in chapter 2, where it says God formed man from the dust of the earth. And so it's kind of God getting his hands dirty, forming man out of dust. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. All right, the creation timeline. The Sumerians and Babylonians, I wasn't able to find any information about how long it took Apsu and the other gods that followed him to create their cosmos. In Egypt, it all happened in one day. And of course, in the Bible, it's revealed to us that God took 6 days to create. Now, God could have done it in one day. He could have done it in a fraction of a second by just speaking it and have everything pop into existence at exactly the same time. But he didn't do that, although he could have. And we'll talk a little bit later about why God might have chosen to do it in 6 days instead of all in an instant. View of the natural phenomena, hurricanes, tornadoes, storms, earthquakes, things like that. The Sumerian and Babylonian believed that these were controlled by gods and goddesses. The Egyptian view was very similar to that these events were, they had a god for the sun. We talked about Ra being the god of the sun. They had moon gods, and they had, earth gods, and all gods were assigned for all these various tasks of making the world operate. And as far as natural phenomena, we don't really have a lot of explanation in Scripture about how the Israelites viewed these natural occurrences. But we learn from Genesis 8 at the end of the flood, God makes a promise to Noah and his family, and also to all of the animals, that says, I'm never doing this again. And so they could have reasonably concluded that Jehovah was the one who controlled at least the weather, because he promised he would never flood the earth in the same way that he did back at Noah's time. All right, so what's the point? What's the point? What jumps out at me is that all of these cultures believed that there were supernatural beings who created the cosmos, which is really interesting because, unlike basically from the Enlightenment forward, we tend to separate the physical from the spiritual. But that's not the way ancient peoples, including the Israelites, viewed things. They viewed it all in one. And that God, Jehovah, as well as the other peoples believing their gods, were intimately involved in the affairs of the earth and the affairs of humanity. And so I think that's, maybe that's an idea that we ought to try to resurrect in our own minds is, you know, God didn't just, like the deists used to say, if you remember, there were some of our founding fathers who were deists, and deists thought, well, yeah, God created everything, but then he just walked away. And he's not involved in anything, hadn't been involved in anything since creation was finished. It's kind of like winding a clock and just let the clock run down. But, you know, in our modern way of thinking, you know, we try to come up with explanations for how everything got to be here. And what's kind of the current scientific view of how it is that the universe came into existence? The Big Bang. And so somebody want to, or you want to go on and tell us what supposedly happened at the Big Bang? Or okay. Well, okay, go ahead.
There was one of you that liked Kathy's note.
All right, go ahead.
Exploded and dark and larger in less than a second. Just bigger and bigger, expanded, more elements started to happen.
Okay. Right. And that's that's something that's observable today. We can actually see, you know, astronomers can see things, you know, so, solar systems, galaxies accelerating away from each other.
People talk about it. I wondered about this. Everything you do is very shifted. So away. I mean, that's the center.
Yeah, go ahead, Wayne. I do think that's how it might have happened. But I mean, where I depart from the Big Bang Theory as it's currently known is that it had to start with some piece of matter. And the question always is, well, where did that little bit of matter go? Because you can only push things back so far before you end up with, well, I don't know, I just think it always existed. Which, of course, that is, and again, I'm not a scientist. My dad was an engineer, so I picked a little bit of it up, that, you know, you can't start something from nothing by natural processes, at least to the best of my knowledge. Yes.
And I heard this very didn't create things, that he put started things in a certain way that he could not cause things to stay. And that you're going to give him the credit for creation and take it away from his time.
Right. Yes,
Well, they
absolutely.
can't explain what happened, but they can explain why or who.
Yeah.
And so that's the part that separates science from religion.
Right. Okay, Scott, go ahead.
Time ago, when I was Einstein, about a lot of this, they had the idea that the universe was eternal and
Mhm.
called steady state.
Steady state.
Because they could not, and Albert Einstein believed in God, but most scientists back then were like, hey, there could be no creation because of the fact that that would mean someone would have to create it. That's what they did not want to answer. And so there was this a monk, a Catholic monk named Lemaitre, and he came up with the idea of an original kernel of the universe that would expand outwards. Because when we do look out, this was really fascinating. When we look out at other galaxies away from us, everything is spreading out. The farther we look away, the faster everything is going.
Mhm.
Everything in our own galaxy is not redshifted, but everything when we look outside of our galaxy is. And so there's always this problem because, see, people that don't believe in God, they start out with the idea, I don't believe in God. And then they try and come up with some way of answering the facts of everything that's out here. But when our universe is so perfectly created, that's a big, big problem for people. That there's got to be no creator. So they come up with the idea of a multiverse, which means this is not just the only creation, the only universe. There's got to be billions and billions of other universes where everything's just a gigantic mess. And so,
And one of them got it right.
yeah, so we're the ones who got it right. So, so that's where the idea of the Big Bang came from. It was actually from a perfectly living God.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've had people ask me, how can you believe in God, believe in the Bible? And when I have mentioned before, if you take a very intricately made clock and take it completely and put it in a cell, how many times would you have to shake it to have it come back to be perfect again?
Right.
Now, you can believe in that, and you think it's strange that I believe in God, but you think things just happen.
Right. Well, I'll get to you in just a sec. Those of you who are scientists in here can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my train went off the track. It had something to do with something you said. It triggered. It's an argument for the existence of a supernatural being who created everything, and it's called the teleological argument or position. And that's the way I heard it explained was, let's say you're hiking in a forest and you're 500 miles from the nearest human. You're just out there in the big middle of nowhere, and you're walking along and you see something kind of glittering in the sunlight, and so you dig around, find it, and it's a gold pocket watch that's partially buried in the dirt. And you pick that thing up and you look at it and you wind it, and lo and behold, the thing appears to keep time. What's the first assumption that you make if you find yourself in that situation? Do you assume it just, we got some gold from here and some something from there, and it just all kind of assembled on its own? No, you assume because it has a design, that it had to have been designed and built by somebody, and they probably just lost it there, not that it just popped into being. Now that's an argument, and there are several for, why it's rational to believe in a creator. And there's a guy, I think he co-wrote the book with Norm Geisler. Anyway, it's called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," and it's if you haven't read it, I encourage you. It's a really, really good book that explains, well, hang on just a sec. Let me get him and then you. My younger son has a problem with faith. He's a scientist, and if he can't fathom it with his five senses, he just doesn't believe it exists. And I'm a lawyer, and in the civil law, that's like if somebody does something wrong to you and you're injured, and so you sue them to try to get money to help put you back where you were as much as possible. The burden of proof, if you want to win a verdict against the person who injured you, all you need to show is it's more likely than not that they caused your injury. Whereas on the criminal side, it's got to be beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, no reasonable person could come to any conclusion other than the person committed the crime. How I view Scripture is God has given us enough evidence that if we want to believe in him, we can. We have evidence from Scripture if we accept Scripture as authoritative. But there's doubt. There's some amount of reasonable doubt that you could have. Because if God had proven everything to the standard of our criminal law, then everybody, if they're rational, would have to say there is a God. Well, that's not really the way God designed us. He wants us to choose him freely, not because we're forced into it. And so that, to me, it kind of helps explain some of this is, if we're looking to find the real story, we can find it. God hasn't left us clueless, just out there wandering around. And I think that was all I was going to say about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's two things. One is that somebody said earlier that everything's moving away from us. It's not necessarily the case, because I think, and maybe Scott can back me up on a few of these things, but we're supposed to run into the Andromeda Galaxy in like a week or so. No, there's several billion years, but
Right.
We're supposed to run into the Andromeda Galaxy. But everything's so far apart, they said even if we were still here, we wouldn't know it was happening. But the other thing I wanted to bring up was, and I can't think of the name of it, but there is a theory out there about the rubber band effect, that the galaxy or the universe is expanding until gravity takes over, and then everything collapses back into the singularity, and it starts all over again. So there is that theory. That's where the singularity is always there.
Mm-hmm.
A rubber band effect, that it happens and explodes, and happens
Interesting.
and explodes.
So the universe is just basically a big yo-yo.
Yeah, basically. I can't think of the name of it, but that's one of the theories.
They wanted that so that that it's accelerating now, so it can never come up. So that means that slaps that away, because people are like, everything's always existed. This is how it always that's how people live.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, Morgan, and then Roy.
So there are scientists out there that believe in a creationist theory, but don't necessarily believe in God. I don't know about percentages, but it's important to make a distinction on the scientific side. But there are evolutionists, big theorists, but there's also creationists, and while they don't want to acknowledge God or that he made the world, because the universe beyond, they acknowledge that there is design And that surely something must have created it, but we just don't know what that is.
Right. Roy, and then Scott.
I'm probably like most of the people in this room. Over the years, I studied many of these theories. Until I read an article about this bank that kept getting counterfeit money. So they set all the colors down and instructed them how to recognize counterfeit money. They still got counterfeit money. So then they set them down and taught them how to recognize real money. If they did, then they could recognize counterfeit. Okay, we've got the real money. And so that's what I studied. I quit studying all these
Yep.
theories, all these ideas, all the counterfeit, and the picture real.
Yes. Scott, go ahead.
You guys, there's tons and tons of scientists that believe in God.
Yes.
So many. I mean, it's really hard to study what God's made, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this decision what you decide to believe God is. I don't know how a doctor could not be a person that believes in God, looking at human bodies.
Yep.
You know, so I would encourage everybody not to just like, oh, science, bad. Because really it's a study of what God's made. You know, it's
Right.
the heart that matters. The heart of who is looking at it and how they're interpreting it.
Right. And Scott, you can give more to this, but during the Enlightenment period, if you look at the scientific discoveries that were made during the Enlightenment period, almost all the scientists who were involved in those discoveries believed in God. Because they said, hey, you know, we can tell by looking that things are organized. And so if it's organized, there had to be some sort of organizer. And therefore, there's got to be clues in the natural world that will help us, you know, understand what that order is and what lessons God might have for us as a result of that. And again, it's only been, you know, probably from the 1800s that we've had this kind of cleavage where there's some scientists who do and there are other scientists who are just as adamantly opposed to it being created by a supernatural being. And so this is one more thing, real interestingly. I read somewhere that the group of scientists who have the highest, who self-describe themselves as believing in a supernatural being creating things, astronomers. And the scientist group that has the least amount of belief are biologists, which seems to me to not make a lot of sense. Again, like Scott mentioned, they study life, and you can see how, you know, all of the organs and everything have to work together in order to keep us alive. And yet, you know, it just all happened, you know, over the, like Sagan said, billions and billions of years. And, you know, we just evolved from, you know, a amoeba and then became a newt and then whatever. Yeah, Wayne.
I consider their discovery that they are simply proving that he exists. And that we can know him, the village between Christians and scientists. Some scientists want to deny the existence of God as part of this creation. And that's simply the words most Christians can hope to talk about science.
Right.
His case in court that he is in fact the creator of heaven and has always been the creator.
Right.
And they get self-confident and they worship him and know that he everything.
Right. Right.
I'm not concerned about this and that. All I'm saying is no
Right. Well, yeah, go ahead. Last comment.
So many, with every, like, paths, you know, in the ocean.
Mhm.
There's just so many
Right.
scientific truths in the Bible that people, only God could have known those scientific.
Right.
We talked last time about gravity. And Job, that he can see the world from nothing.
Right.
And that was the first book.
Right. The Paths of the Sea story is real interesting, but we are out of time. And, but we'll talk about that. And also maybe briefly a little bit about Exodus and the food laws. Thanks for your